Hi, this is Barry, and welcome to the Simplicity Zen podcast. Today, my guest is Rafe Martin. He began Zen practice in 1970 and is a lay transmitted koan teacher who received Inka from Dainin Henry Roshi in 2012. And then in 2016, Rafe received full Dharma transmission as an independent teacher and Dharma heir of Dainin Roshi. He has been a student of various teachers in the Harada Yasutani line, including Dainin Henry Roshi, Philip Kapleau Roshi, and Robert Aiken Roshi. Rafe is the founder and head teacher of the Endless Path Zendo in Rochester, New York. Rafe also has a master's degree in English literature and literary criticism and is an award-winning author and storyteller. Thanks so much for being with us today.
You're very welcome.
Yeah.
Nice to be here, Barry.
Yeah. So could you mention in the context of your lineage what the difference is between Inka and full Dharma transmission and how that affected the way you taught or what your authority was and so forth?
Sure. As far as I know, believe me, I'm not technically that sharp on any of these things in some ways. But when I completed the Diamond Sangha Koan curriculum with Dainin Henry Roshi, he gave me an Inka certificate that I successfully completed the Koan curriculum, and that I was authorized to teach. And at that point, I was an associate teacher, and I did that for I think maybe 4 years before. Maybe a little bit more than 4 years, because I think it was December of maybe 2011. And then I started in January of 2012 with associate teaching. So I began teaching, and then in 2016, I received full Dharma transmission, no longer as an associate teacher or an assistant, but as an independent teacher on my own. So receiving Inka was recognition of my successful completion of the Koan curriculum, which I'd actually begun with Kapleau Roshi years earlier and had become a disciple, an official, personal disciple of Kapleau Roshi. Then when he was retiring, I had a kind of transitional session with Dainin. And Dainin Roshi happened to connect me with Aiken Roshi, and I happened to be speaking in Hawaii not long after that. So I kind of connected with Aiken Roshi, and I really was very moved by him and what opened up with the Koan curriculum that I was already working on with him. And so we worked together for, I think, about 4 years. And then I really worked for about 13 years with Dainin Roshi after that, leading the Aiken line of Koan, which is the Diamond Sangha Koan curriculum. And then Dainin asked me to start teaching. It's not something I ever aimed for. I didn't practice in order to become a teacher in any way. I had a very active life as an author and storyteller at that point. But Dainin wanted me to start teaching, and I felt it was a time in my life to share something that had really been the core of everything I've been about for many, many years since I'd started back in 1970. And so that just kind of fell into place at that point.
Great. And so you started the Endless Path Zendo. That's in Rochester, New York. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's half our house. Half our house is the Zendo temple. I had no interest in, and I was too old really to think of starting a center, and I didn't want to move somewhere. We grew up here. We grew up here as adults anyway. Our kids grew up. They're grown people. Our friends are here. Our roots are here, and I felt doing something, not creating a center, but a Zendo, where people would practice out of their lives, which is I practiced my whole life as a layperson. Even though Roshi Kapleau and I were very close, and in fact, my wife, Rose, and Roshi Kapleau were also very, very close. We were like family. We traveled with them. We lived with them. He would come to our house or to use our Japanese bath and have meals and watch movies. And we just did a lot of things together. But essentially, when he was retiring, it just seemed like an important shift. And I didn't want to replicate a kind of center experience as I'd always practiced and my wife has practiced as lay people. I wanted to really create something that would offer a path of maturing as a human being in the midst of your own life. To me, that's what Zen is really about. It's not about anything really even Asian in some ways. It's really about how do we grow up beyond our own self-centeredness, something that the world desperately needs these days. And I felt as lay people, we've taken vows, essentially bodhisattva vows, to be who we are, to take care of our children, to have work that's meaningful, that brings something into the world, and to turn our back on those things, to take on for us, a monastic or semi-monastic style, for people who are in tune with what I'm doing, would not make sense. So we turned half our house into the temple, and it's people, we practice as lay people. People come, my students come, we practice, we have, I think we have a Monday night informal practice, Tuesday night Doksan and Zazen, Wednesday morning Doksan on Zazen, Wednesday night Zazen and a healing service, and Saturday we have Zazen, Doksan, and Teisho. And then once a month we either have a half-day Zazen Kai or a full-day Zazen Kai, and every couple of months we have a 2 to 4 day sesshin. We're really geared to lay practice so that you practice and then you bring it into your life, and it has to function. It's not a withdrawal from your life, but a way of maturing as the human being you are, with your cares and responsibilities and commitments. And so Endless Path Zendo was very much a zendo, not a center, a place where people could come, do doksan, have ceremony, sit, and go back into their life to use it. And so it's kind of intimate. Our practice is quite intimate.
Are most of your students and the people who come around, are they pretty established practitioners, or are you getting new people coming in?
We're getting quite a range. We have some people who've practiced for many years who have been on staff at various Zen centers in the past, in full monastics in the past, now have families. Some people who not necessarily young, but new to Zen, who might have practiced in other traditions, either Buddhism or other things, and found that Zen was really speaking to them, especially a lay practice. And so our people tend to be mature. Either that can be an age, or the fact that even if they're young, they've been through a number of mills with practice already. Some are new to koan practice. Some are taking up koan practice after some years of not, and some are switching from the kind of koan practice maybe they were doing in a more monastic setting to a lay practice using the Diamond Sangha curriculum.
So you say you didn't grow up in Rochester. Where did you actually grow up?
I grew up in New York City.
Okay.
Yeah. So we moved here in 1970 specifically for the Rochester Zen Center.
Oh, interesting.
Because we kept coming into Roshi Kapleau, and he would say, we'd see him in different, wherever we were in different places. We were sitting on our own, and we'd attend a thing with him in Toronto, where I was in graduate school. And he'd say, why don't you move to Rochester? And we go, I don't know. And then we'd see him in Binghamton after I left graduate school. We went back to where we had gone to undergraduates. We've been at Harper College, and we're now, I think it's Binghamton University is what it's called now. And we'd had lunch with him. And he said, well, why don't you move to Rochester? We said, I don't know. And then our son was born. And when he was 8 weeks old, we said, we better grow up and we've got to get down to it. And we moved to Rochester when he was 8 weeks old.
Wow.
And just planted ourselves here. So that's where it kind of began.
And what kind of family did you grow up in? Was it like working class, or were your parents intellectuals? What kind of scene did you have?
Well, they were kind of both. The thing was, my dad in World War II, I was born, essentially 9 months after he got back from overseas, but he had been intelligence and helped direct one of the first search and rescue crews of the Himalayas. So he was stationed in Chabwa, Assam, and flying over the Himalayas to Kunming, China. So I grew up with all kinds of things from Asia in our house. And he had been trained he was an artist and also had been trained as a draftsman, which is why I think he ended up, actually, he was the person who made all the maps for both the US and British forces of the Himalayas.
Wow.
For flying the hum. And so that's why he ended up doing navigation and was one of the only, I think, one of two people to survive. It was you can Google it, the crew was called Blackie's Gang. It kind of became famous. He was not officially with them, but he was their intelligence officer and often flew as navigator because he had made the maps and knew how to get to where crews had crashed and pilots were downed and they needed medical aid and stuff. So I grew up with a lot of things from Asia. And he, when he came back from overseas, actually ended up working for his uncle, managing and directing a fleet of taxi cabs in New York City. It was a thing. A lot of young guys came back from overseas and they just wanted to have normal lives and jobs. And that's kind of what he did. And my mom had been accepted to Hunter College as a young woman, but her family never had the money for her to go. And during the war, she worked managing, I guess, fine instruments manufacturing in New York City as part of the war effort. My dad came back. She just left and became a housewife. But my family was really Ukrainian Jews. So behind them, they were first generation. Behind them was a great deal of trauma, chaos of the world. My mother's mother, when she was 16, had to be secreted out of Ukraine because the Russian secret police were after her. She never saw her family again. So those became the family stories, that the world is complex, nothing settled. There's a great deal of impermanence in the works. And then, weirdly, my mother loved things from China and Japan, and my dad had served as intelligence in the Himalayas. So I grew up with a lot of Asia kind of in the house.
Interesting.
And
was it kind of a secular Jewish household?
Yeah, exactly right. It was like we'd, go to temple on the high holy days, have Hanukkah. Otherwise, it was kind of, they wanted to have barbecues and be middle-class Americans.
So kind of as a kid and a teenager, what was your take on the world? Were you having fun? Was it scary? Were you kind of questioning who you were? What?
As a teenager? Geez, that's a long time.
Or as a kid, some people seem to be struck by impermanence pretty young, and some people don't.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say. I would say I spent a lot of my childhood up in the tops of trees. I just climb up trees and sit there. So obviously, things on the ground weren't seeming to me the safest of places to be, is, I guess, what I would gather from that. And I spent a lot of time reading books and, making armor and having sword fights in the neighborhood and reenacting the Arthurian tales. So imaginative, running around. And I would say by the time high school hit, I was probably pretty unhappy, pretty lonely kind of person. When I had a choice to either stay in New York City or go away to college, I chose a state school upstate. I could leave New York. And when I met my wife to-be, Rose, we actually did get married, even though we met as freshmen. Her story, she was born in a displaced persons camp after the Holocaust. She was born in Italy, and English was her fourth language. She came speaking English, Serbo-Croatian, Italian, and Yiddish. And then learned English, rather, at 3.5 when she came.
So she's Jewish ancestry as well, then.
Yeah, the sense of impermanence and things being awry in the world were kind of woven into my life, because Rose and I met when we were like 17. So, and my own family background suggested a degree of trauma and displacement as well. And then my interest in school was myth and story. I was reading Joseph Campbell in 1962, was kind of moving in the direction of mythic criticism. And that's kind of what drew me, myth and story, and coming out of the kind of post-war world.
Were you, do you remember when like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings came out? Were you taken by those at all?
We discovered The Hobbit through a friend in probably 1964. And it was a stunning kind of experience. I'd never heard of The Hobbit. My book from sixth grade on, my favorite book was Moby Dick. I don't know how that happened. I walked into the drugstore at sixth grade, saw the cover of a whale being hunted. I devoured a somewhat abridged version. It just didn't have all the cetology, all the details of whale formats that Melville put together. And then my senior honors thesis, which eventually turned me into the first person at my college to receive highest honors in English, was on Moby Dick. So it had been a lifelong love. And then somewhere in there was The Hobbit. And then probably by 1966, when we graduated, was The Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
What did Lord of the Rings make an impression on you at all from a legendary mythic point of view?
Oh, totally. I remember I was working, and that's the summer, I guess, after maybe freshman year of college. I was part of the summer I worked as a runner on Wall Street for because I thought maybe I'd be a lawyer or something. I worked for one of the huge law firms. They had 2 floors of the Chase Manhattan building, and it was run by a little Irish bookie, from New Jersey, who ran the messenger's room. And it was quite a little crew of high school dropouts, college dropouts, a couple of college people like myself. And I was sitting there reading before it was the authorized edition, it was the Ace. I don't know if you remember those, the Ace paperbacks.
Yeah, I used to collect Tolkien books, so
okay.
I don't know all this. I know all this to an embarrassing degree.
Okay, so I'm reading the Ace paperback where who was it? Eowyn, who strikes the Nazgul in the messenger room, with all these kind of crazy guys, and I'm reading the part where she says, "No man can harm me," and she pulls back her helmet and her long.
I'm no man.
I am not a man. And the tears are starting to come out of my eyes. I'm sitting there in the messenger room, having to wipe my eyes with all these hard cases around me. So yeah, Lord of the Rings definitely moved me, and very much part of the mythopoeic world. I went to Toronto because Northrop Frye was teaching there, who was at that time the world's leading mythopoeic literary critic, and that's who I wanted to train with.
When did Wizard of Earthsea come out? Was that around that time, or was that later?
I don't remember. I wasn't grabbed by that initially. Weird things that led me to connect with Zen and Buddhism from the Jataka tales that were in The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And then I remember reading Alan Watts, and then we got Alan Watts to come to our college, or I had lunch with Alan Watts. Then I remember running into Allen Ginsberg down in the Village and having a beer with him, and Moby Dick was my favorite book, and it was a book that meant a great deal to him as well. And just these little kind of conversations that were myth and life. And of course, that was a period where, psychedelics were first coming in. And all of that was kind of, an ordinary life at the time, with myth and story and the movements of Buddhism, and wanting to really knowing that there was something more than what we were seeing in our culture and in our world, and that it could be awoken to, was part of the thinking that so many of us were immersed in at the time.
Did you try psychedelics personally?
Yeah, I did. I found it very important. Of course, given my proclivity for overdoing and thinking I knew more than I did, I made some terrible mistakes. And I remember thinking at one point, well, if things get really bad, I'm going to go and practice Zen. And lo and behold, things got really bad, and we ended up on the doorstep of the Rochester Zen Center with an 8-week-old child. Yeah.
So did you said there was kind of Asian artifacts and so forth in your house? Were there actually like books about like the Tao Te Ching or Zen or
No, it was
Buddhism
like,
or anything like that? Or
more
was it
stuff
more just,
about India,
okay?
more like little figures, like, carved stuff from India. And, the wonder that was India was a book, and a lot of photos. My dad was the intelligence officer, and then when he came back was at Homestead Air Force Base down in the Everglades, because he was training other people who were going to fly the Himalayas, and a hurricane destroyed the base about a month before I was to be born. So they moved back to New York City. I was born in a snowstorm, which was the beginning of my recognition of impermanence from the Everglades, and all your prenatal influences of warmth and sunlight. And I got born in a snowstorm. I wasn't prepared for that. But my dad had these, huge albums of all the intelligence records, which were Himalayas. And he was trading with the Naga people, who were headhunters at the time, to bring out American flyers. And so there was a sense of indigenous culture and artifacts, also very much India. And then because my mom had loved things from China and Japan, he brought things back on his way home, silk and clothing and stuff like that, and kinds of jewelry. And so it just, our house was not like middle-class knotty pine. It was more like bamboo and scrolls. So it was a little different.
Do you remember where you first heard about Zen and or Buddhism? Because I know that era Zen was kind of broken out from Buddhism to some degree with Alan Watts and so forth.
Yeah, though I never found that. To me, they kind of came together. And I think it really began probably in 1962, reading The Hero with 1,000 Faces. A lot of things about Buddhism and Buddhist myth and the life of the Buddha was in there. And I really resonated with that, the kind of universal aspect of it. And then shortly after that, somehow Alan Watts's work kind of came in, and the two things were happening around the same time. And then I had a teacher, professor, who he and I really hit it off. And he was very much into the metaphysical poets of the 17th century and mystical literature. And he was very moved by Zen. And eventually, he and I and one other guy took our first LSD trip together, based on that foundation. And it was very sweet and very moving. So all of those things were coming together pretty much around the same time, 62 to 66, somewhere in there, but filtering in you didn't have to look for, wasn't looking for it. It just, that's what was coming in.
Part of the ethos. At that stage, did you have any interest in meditation, or even did it cross your mind to meditate? Was that part of it for you?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I can answer it, because at that time, Alan Watts and the Way of Zen spoke about it sort of, but he never got down to meditation. I don't think it was later that formal meditation became an interest. It was this some kind of awakening, and certainly there were enough experiences between marijuana and the little bit that I explored LSD to say there is a normal, a natural, another kind of consciousness that's not self-centered, in which the world sits in. And that, to me, and that's what myth was about, maturing to that kind of world, to live from that kind of condition. And it was that later, I think, when I realized those things were not really going to stay as my path for whatever reasons. So I can give you a lot, but it doesn't really matter. That's when, I know what happened. It was in 1967, we had a friend. He had been with Timothy Leary at Millbrook.
Mm-hmm.
He looked like the most straight guy, and everyone had long hair. He had a neat haircut, no hair, facial hair. His name was Bernie. I don't remember his last name.
Sanders.
And he
Saunders.
See,
Saunders, Bernie
what?
Saunders. No, I'm just kidding.
No. I don't remember his last name. He was a very nice guy. We became good friends. And he looked like that because he had a trial coming up about STP, and he wanted to look as normal as possible. And somehow, I don't know if he was, we were in Toronto because I was in graduate school there. There was a huge expatriate American community in Toronto at the time because of the Vietnam War. And he one day looked at us, and we were kind of innocents in that realm. He was much more experienced, but a very sweet guy. He looked at us and said, there's a book that just got published. It's called The Three Pillars of Zen. And I think it's your path. You should read it. So Rose and I both read that book in 1967. And immediately we both started sitting in our little garret apartment in Toronto when I was a graduate student. And it just worked for us. We just felt it just whatever. Then things kind of went haywire. As I said, I made some really dumb mistakes. And then Roshi Kapleau started showing up in our life. First in Toronto, and then we'd have dinner with him, and then we left and we went to Binghamton, back where we had gone to school, and he showed up there, and we had a little sitting group. And so there was just some kind of rhythm of something that I can't consciously say how it came into place, but there it was.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about what Kapleau was like? What were your first impressions of him?
He was very impressive. I mean, he was just very down to earth. There was nothing esoteric. There was nothing airy. He was a very solid guy. He had a very dramatic face. I mean, it was really a powerful face. But we also knew something of his history. I mean, he'd been the chief court reporter for the Nuremberg War Tribunals and also the Tokyo trials. And that meant a lot to us, with my wife coming out of the Holocaust. And in fact, a lot of my Ukrainian family was murdered in the Holocaust as well. And so having that background said something about somebody he told us that's kind of what got him into Zen. From the trials in Nuremberg, he was then sent to Tokyo to be the chief court reporter for those trials. And he said, taking in all that testimony of what human beings can do to one another when they have no sense of what they really are. And he said, walking around the grounds of the Zen temples in Tokyo, he felt a kind of peace that he never experienced before and wanted more of that. And so the pain, the suffering that he experienced and took in all the testimony of during those trials is kind of what brought him to Zen, that being in Japan. And also he said there was a difference. He said, in Germany, people seemed to have no sense of why they had suffered so much towards the end of the war. And he said in Japan, people said, oh, yes, we this suffering is our due because we caused harm to others. This is karma. And he said, what's karma? And, that began to shift him. And then when he got back to New York City, after that, he began going to the lectures of D.T. Suzuki at Columbia. That he was just, he had a court reporting business. He was reading a lot about Zen, and he became really kind of stuck up. He just told us all this, and not stuck up, but a know-it-all about Zen, but he knew nothing. And eventually he started his business and moved to Japan and put himself through some very difficult things for a guy at that age coming out of American culture at the time,
right? With
the Japanese who had just been defeated in the war just a few years before. And you kind of saw I felt a kind of nobility and courage in his face and a solidity. And our world was quite chaotic at the time. I mean, we were, 20 years old, 22 years old. And it was chaos, the Vietnam War, what was happening with psychedelics, civil rights. And he was a person who just seemed pretty steady on, who'd been through his own kind of trauma and emerged through something. And the book, and The Three Pillars, was such a good book, such a moving book, that there was something compelling for us, and we just felt connected with him. But it took us a while to move there, because we kept meeting him. We kept going, yeah, well, we'll see, And then when we had a child, it was like, we better get to work on ourselves.
So when he was just out and about, like at a restaurant and stuff, would he wear Western clothing, or would he wear like kind of Samu type?
Yeah, he might wear a Roxo under his sweater or something like that. Yeah, but he never wore robes and stuff out and about.
So you, real briefly about your career, you were fascinated by myths and storytelling and stuff, and that became your career. Like what was your day job like after graduate school?
Well, after graduate school, we were in, that wasn't a job, that was surviving. For about a year, we just farmed essentially in backwoods Pennsylvania. And then when our son was born, that was after I left graduate school. I was teaching as a graduate assistant at the University of Toronto. So when I left that, I left all of that. And then we decided we'd move to Rochester. And basically I worked construction. I washed dishes in kitchens. I substitute taught. And then eventually we opened a bookstore. We started by kind of taking over the Zen Center's incense and book, service, which was kind of bizarre. We opened it. We put it in a closet in our apartment, and then we started eventually branching out. Began to go down to New York City and find. Well, you can't find these days original Buddhas out of China and Japan and Korea. I mean, good Buddhas you could still find, and because we were a business, I had a wholesale license, so I could go into places that sold to the Museum of the Metropolitan Museum or to various collectors, and I could go in and find relatively, at the time, inexpensive Buddhas. So we started developing this kind of network of bringing Buddhas back, selling them at cost, connecting to people that were practicing. And then the bookstore kind of grew and out on the street. Became really an award-winning bookstore, and then I moved from that. That kind of the book world was getting killed by the chains that were opening, and then I began storytelling in the store, and eventually became the storyteller in residence for the Rochester City Schools, working with inner city kids, everything from kindergarten through high school, and was doing 5 days a week, 3 performances a day, teaching kids how to connect. And they were tracking, and they could track that attendance was up every day I was in that particular school. I was rotating around. And so that was a really powerful sign to me that something was cooking with story that our culture needed as much as I did. And my first books started coming out. My first book was a collection of Jataka tales with Shambhala. Shambhala. So it was 1984.
I think I know that. So that's you. Interesting.
Three Tigers. Yeah, the original edition, which had no commentaries. It was just, I think, 20 stories. Yeah, that came out in 84 and had illustrations by a friend of mine, Richard Lerman.
I know that book. That's funny.
And then my book started coming out, and the first one was a Jataka tale, and it was an ALA notable book illustrated by Ed Young, who's one of the great American. And it just kind of grew. And then I started getting calls around the country. And then I started having a full-time job as the bookstore died as an author and storyteller, and traveled all over, spoke all over in all kinds of places, schools, libraries, museums. And that was my career for the next years, many years, until really I kind of, I guess, became more of an author, less of a performer, but I was featured at some of the big venues, Museum of Natural History, the Joseph Campbell Foundation of Myth and Festival of Myth and Story, the National Storytelling Festival, things like that. And then, I don't know, I get moved towards Zen teaching because Dana asked me to start doing that. And I
Mm-hmm.
felt I had done enough of the children's that was over for me. It moved from the mythic to the cute and the clever with the rise of places like Barnes and Noble, and
Mm-hmm.
just wanting, it was a different atmosphere. The kind of books I wanted to write
Mm-hmm.
just were not getting published much anymore. And our kids have grown up, so I didn't feel the need to be writing lots of children's books.
Right. So,
Yeah.
when did you start sitting like regularly with Capello? Was it when you saw him in
1970.
different places, or was it when you went to?
1970.
So it was when you
We
went
were
to
sitting
Rochester.
on our own. Yeah, we were sitting on our own, but it
Mhm.
was, 10 minutes a day or something, but regular formal practice. I started going to Sesshin 1970, uh,
Mhm.
right off the bat, just
Mhm.
jumped in. So 1970 is when we started formally.
Mhm. Did he give you Moo right away, like, or did he have you work on your breaths at first, or how did that work?
No, he felt I should work on Moo. And
Mhm.
to be honest, I kind of felt that I detested Moo. Uh, the atmosphere, as I said, I'd created some very difficult things for myself, trying to combine uh, Zen meditation as I knew about it from the three pillars of Zen and psychedelics,
Mhm.
and had really created some very big blocks for myself
Mhm.
and damage. And the atmosphere at the Zen Center was very Japanese at the time and very monastic, semi-monastic.
Mhm.
Most of the people there back then their aspiration was to be a monk or nun. That's all they knew about Zen. And
Mhm.
here we were with a child and
Mhm.
needing to earn a living. We were totally out of sync with the atmosphere of the time. However, for whatever reason, Roshi Kaplorose and I connected deeply, and he just kept encouraging me to keep with it.
Mhm.
At some point, when the our bookstore, the Oxcart bookshop, was folding, and I was starting to storytell, for 10 years, I didn't go to Sesshin.
Mhm.
I just decided it was time to ignore that whole atmosphere and come forward into Zen as the person I was,
Did you
not
sit in
trying to.
Dokusan?
I stopped going to Doksan too,
Mhm.
and I just sat. So I went to sittings and I went to Teisho every week, but I was traveling a lot more and
Mhm.
speaking around the country and giving talks about story and myth, language. And
Mhm.
then wherever I was, hotel, motel, backwoods, I stayed in some odd places around the country, depending on where the schools were. I
Mhm.
did Zazen
Mhm.
wherever I was, morning and night,
Mhm.
and tried to bring that into the storytelling I was doing wherever I was appearing, whatever situation, whatever school, whatever culture.
Mhm.
And I did that for 10 years until I felt uh, I was coming forward not out of information I'd been given about what Zen was to be, but out of my own life and my own understanding. And then I went to my first session in 10 years and was passed on my koan in that first session, and then began doing subsequent koan practice after that.
Mhm.
Uh, from
Was
then
there a
on in.
corresponding shift in perception that kind of facilitated your passing Moo, or was it just kind of more of a gradual buildup over those 10 years, would you say?
I think it was becoming normal and natural. It's like if you want truth, you can't do it by evading yourself.
Mhm.
You have to do it by maturing as yourself. And the style of the Western Zen I knew at the Rochester Center at the time, I didn't find conducive for lay people. It
Mhm.
was not that kind of atmosphere, and I needed to find that for myself and create it for myself. And I just felt coming forward out of that, it all made sense. It all fell into place. Why I had been drawn to Zen, and the whole point of maturing as a human being, not becoming something special with a particular haircut or a particular style of clothing or speaking in a particularly Japanese sort of way, but touching base with a not self-centered self, and learning to live from that. And so it just felt real in a way that it hadn't. It had been artificial for me before then. That was my route. I can't say that's what everyone should do. That's what I had to do. And then after that, it just kind of moved along, and things unfolded. And then when Roshi Kapleau, as I said, was retiring, I felt, even though he and I and Rose and he and all the three of us were very, very close personally, he was like a father to us. I mean, even his daughter said, "You're his family." There were maybe 8 or 9 of us that he had that relationship with. I felt I really needed to leave the whole style that I'd grown up with and really practice as a layperson. And of course, Roshi had been working after he was a teacher through Kapleau Roshi, then began working with Aiken Roshi. And I began seeing the changes in him and felt, gosh, that makes sense to me. And then when I happened to be in Hawaii, just karma, I happened to be speaking in Hawaii. Then I connected with Aiken Roshi and found it really revelatory in ways that I felt were missing from what I knew or understood. And his, of course, Diamond Song is completely lay. There is no ordination even. So it felt like this was a kind of natural unfolding as well. And it was just time to move in that direction.
So aside from lay or not, or dress and stuff, is there a different texture of the practice in Diamond Sangha compared to what you experienced with Kapleau?
Well, yeah, I think there's more of a Dogen atmosphere to the koan practice. There's an allowing, I love both these men. But, Kapleau Roshi was, again, like a father, but his atmosphere was in Doksan. If he was going to ring you out, he would see something like, work hard. And Aiken Roshi would say, like, muse on that. So that's a very different atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Aiken Roshi had this, he used the word intimacy for realization or enlightenment. And, the style I grew up with, let's say, was that you get enlightened. And I found that wasn't really true. And intimacy made much more sense, that you become intimate with this leaf, this breath, this cup of tea, this person. You don't get enlightenment. You are less there, and the world steps in. That intimacy is realization. The word intimacy and realization mean the same thing. And Aiken Roshi really made that point clear and emphasized, Dogen saying, to move the self forward to become one with the 10,000 things is called delusion. But for the 10,000 things to step in and realize themselves as the self is intimacy or realization. Mm-hmm. And it was that atmosphere of koan practice that, to me, opened up a very subtle and satisfying path, where it wasn't like, oh, you got this koan, now on to the next. It was really this koan, each time with each one, was satisfying. You touch base with something right there. And to me, I can't say that's how it all went. I can only say, for me, that's how the difference went. That for me, though Roshi Kapleau and I remained very, very close, personally, I found Aiken Roshi's teaching at that time matured something in me that I don't think ever would have matured if I hadn't gone in that direction. And I'm very, very grateful for that.
Very interesting.
It was missing.
So logistically, did you start over with koans with him, or did you just kind of pick up?
We went through things that he felt could be refined in what I had done. And then eventually, I was very moved one day out of the blue. He said to me, and I had no idea how this worked at all. He just said to me, I'm not taking students anymore, but I will take you as a student. But you'd have to move to Hawaii. And I went, I moved to Rochester for a purpose like that, and I don't think I'd ever do that again. Plus, I don't see how I can support a family as a wandering storyteller in Hawaii. It's terribly expensive, and at any place I'd speak outside Hawaii would be an expensive plane. And I just don't see how I can do that being responsible to my family. I'm sorry, repeat your question because it's reminding me of so many things.
I don't remember what my question was. Yeah, just continue down that thread. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd ask you if you started over koans.
Oh, yeah. So with Aiken Roshi, we did some checking. In fact, I had just gone to Doksan with them for the first time because I was there speaking in Hawaii, and I had old friends from Rochester who were very close with, actually, I think Clark Ratcliffe was head of the Zendo at Pololo at the time. And so they connected me up, and I was sitting there, and I tapped them. I said, I'd like to go to Doksan with Aiken Roshi just to pay my respects. I hadn't intended to do koan practice. I was just there to pay my respects. And when I went in, we had a nice chat, and I said, I'd like you to check me. And so we began doing, while I was there speaking every night, I'd kind of go to Doksan and he'd check things. And then I began a couple of times going to Hawaii and just there speaking. And then every day he would have me come to Doksan, not when it wasn't official Doksan time. And we just go through checking stuff. And he kept doing that for me. And then when it was clear that it was, and when his wife Anne died, and I was there when she died, she was making sure he kept up on his correspondence, because then we would correspond on koan points, and she would have him get back to me immediately. After she died, he, like me, was not very organized. And so months could go by without a response. And it used to come, and I realized I just can't do that. I can't do it like that. So he recommended, I see about working with Nelson Foster Roshi, and I did that for a very little bit. Nelson, I think, is a terrific teacher, but it just was too far for me up in the Northern Sierras, and the kind of travel and expense and everything involved with it. And Danon by then had completed redoing everything with Aiken Roshi. And we had been old friends. He had a similar background. He'd been a mime in New York City. He was a performer, and I knew him. And he was also interested in myth and story. We had a lot in common, and I knew him from Rochester. And because he had completed the Diamond Sangha koan curriculum, and Aiken Roshi had given him a letter saying he was a Diamond Sangha Dharma master, I decided I should see, because he combined both sides of my lineage. He was a Kapleau Roshi lineage teacher, and he knew about all my experience and my way of approaching things through there, and the places I might be stuck coming from that kind of perspective and whatever habits it had engendered in me. And he also had the Diamond Sangha koan curriculum through Aiken Roshi. So I felt that would be a good match, and indeed we hit it off. And then when I started with him, we started right back at Mu. We just redid everything, which I had already done with Aiken Roshi. I'd done all the checking questions with Aiken Roshi for Mu, and then moved on to other koans, and essentially the gateless barrier, Wumen Kwan. But with Danon, I decided, let's just start and go through the whole thing. And so we just started over and just went through everything, and then did the two additional books that at the time Kapleau Roshi hadn't had, the Shoyoroku and Denkoroku, and then did everything a second time, and then went through specific cases that were whatever questions I might have. And it just felt like a good way to do things. And for whatever reason, doing those koans brought a kind of happiness into my life. So it was good to do.
You still lived in the East Coast, right?
I still live in Rochester.
Yeah. So would you just fly out for sesshin, or would you guys correspond, or would you call, or like how would you?
You mean with Danon?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would go to a couple of 7 days sesshin a year, and then do 2 doksan by phone or whatever, that way live a week. So I set up my schedule. If I would be there for 2 doksan a week, whatever.
I know some people do doksan through phone. I know Nelson Foster did I just can't conceive of Dokusansu fun. I
Well,
can't even picture it. I mean, obviously
you
it
know,
works, but
yeah, and I had enough years of koan practice, and also we didn't start doing it like that. I did a year or so of just flying out to Denver and
Mhm.
being in person with Danon. And when we got enough stuff cleared out, he said, "Okay, now we're at the point where we can do this not in person." So I'd go to 2 7-day sesshin a year, and at minimum, and then we'd do 2 doksan every week
Mhm.
essentially, unless I was just totally unavailable.
Mhm.
But I really set up my schedule to be there for those 2 doksan. And then, it just kind of, that's how we did it.
Great.
Yeah.
And the I should remember this, but in the Diamond Sangha, do they do the 5 ranks and the
Yes.
precepts? Yeah, so you did those too.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then when you finished all it, he gave you Inca and asked you to start assistant teaching.
First, he asked me, what keeps you practicing all these years? And I said, well, for me, and also here's the thing, I would go out a few days before sesshin, and I'd stay with Danon. We might do some koan work, and then I'd stay a day or two after, and we'd do some additional koan work. And so I was living with him when I go out there, and he was really very generous with me. And he said, well, what keeps you practicing all these years? Because, I started in 1970. Now we're looking at, we're in the 2000s. We're in 2004, 2005. And I said, it's the life of the Buddha and the Jataka tales. It's the vow of the Bodhisattva. So many people practice Zen and they think it's about getting something and, it's cool, it's Zen-y. And we do the 4 vows at the end of a sitting, or great vows for all. But people don't realize they're taking bodhisattva vows. That's what Zen is about. And for me, the life of the Buddha and the Jataka tales, showing him working on himself through challenges and difficulties and failures over and over, makes it clear that this is a path of long-term commitment and transformation, not getting something and being cool and being done at all.
Mhm.
And it's the life of the Buddha that really, and the Jataka tales that really made that clear to me and triggered something in me, that I have to keep going. And he said, well, here we do ordination. Would you be interested? And he gave me this whole bunch of sheets and papers. And I said, after I looked through, I said, yeah. So in 2009, he kind of created something that doesn't really exist, which is he called it full lay ordination. In other words, he said, you're being ordained at the same level as a monk or priest, but as a layperson. And it was like a 6 month of going through various tests and writing things and answering things and whatevering. And then
What kind of tests, like Buddhist philosophy?
on Buddhist doctrine,
Hmm.
and being able to communicate clearly and being able to say what this is or demonstrate. Or it was very, I learned a lot from doing it. And then at the end of a sesshin, I had the ordination ceremony, and that was in 2009. And then 2 years later is when he asked me to start teaching. As that was 2011, end of 2011. It was after Rohatsu, December.
Was that your
Said I
first
want.
Rakusu, your lay ordination?
No, I had a Rohatsu from the early '80s with Kapla Roshi. You see, there's
Okay.
two kinds. We do. There's two styles, and here at Endless Path Zendo, we combine both. In the Kapla line, the way I knew it, I don't really know what. I assume they do it similarly now. There was only group Jukai. In other words, it's open to anyone, and we do Jukai together. And then if you want to receive a Roxu, I think originally it was you had to have completed the gateless barrier koans, but it created so much stress in the Sangha, so much unhappiness because people felt there were insiders now and outsiders.
Hmm.
But Kaplo Roshi very kindly and wisely said, okay, if you've practiced here for 3 years and would like to receive a Roxu, just ask and you can. And I actually created a list of several thousand Buddhist names, like Western Buddhist names, Zenson, Lawson, uh, uh, Great Vow, whatever. And I gave Roshi Kapleau, I had a language samadhi one day, and I gave him a list of 2,000 Buddhist names or more, which then the Zen Center, as far as I know, in Rochester, still uses for the Roxus to give Buddhist names to people. And actually, because my handwriting was so bad, and I was writing on the backs of envelopes, I just couldn't stop it. It was just like this language samadhi. He gave me the typewriter that he wrote the 3 pillars on, so that I could type them up so he could read them. So the group Jukai was the Kapleau way. Aitken Roshi, as far as I know, and I began doing this with him, and it never completed. I did it with Danon eventually, was to receive a Roxu, you had to do an individual Jukai, where you personalized each of the 16 Bodhisattva precepts. In other words, the precept would be stated, and then you would present how you specifically in your life was going to uphold and embody that particular precept. And so in Aitken line, there's only the individual. And because I'm really a hybrid, I feel Endless Path Zendo is a hybrid of what I think of as what I found most significant in Kapleau line and most significant and in Aitken line. We do both. We have annually, every New Year's Eve, a group Jukai open to everyone. But if you want to receive a Roxu and a Buddhist name, then you do an individual Jukai and you present. And it may be several months if we go back and forth. I'll go back and forth with the person until I feel their vows are clear. Then at the end of a Zazen Kai or a Sesshin, they will do that ceremony and receive a Roxu. But I had received a Roxu many years earlier from Kapleau Roshi and a Buddhist name. And then when I was ordained by Danon, he asked me my Buddhist name. And he said, "Oh, that's a good name for you. Why don't you keep it?" So then he gave me a marker, a lotus marker on the Roxu for his ordination. And then when I became a teacher, then it was a new Buddhist name and a new Roxu.
I remember reading at some point, I don't know if it was Rochester or if it was in Japan at Yasutani's place, where if someone broke through in Kensho, there'd be a ceremony, saying like in front of everyone else at the end of Sesshin, and they'd get a certificate. Did you ever see any of that stuff?
No, that was, and I think that would have been really disastrous or painful.
Yeah, I was shocked when I read that. Yeah.
Yeah. And Aitken Roshi, I was only with him for about 4 years, so I can't speak to everything he said or did. But, and a lot of our connection was by mail, though, I did spend some time with him whenever I could. He didn't like the expression breaking through at all. He said, "Who breaks through to what? That's not really what happens." And it creates a very dualistic sense, doesn't it? People think they're going to be themselves and they're going to break through to something grander. But that's not what happens.
Maybe more of a falling away.
Yeah, that the self that you're so habitually running through your head becomes less and less, and the world steps in more and more, and there's intimacy. The self-centered self falls away, and you realize this leaf, this tree, this pebble, this person, this breath, this as one's own self. There's no separation, but it's not like I break through to something. He felt that language was really destructive, and indeed, I think it creates. I don't use it at all because when I think of my many early years in Zen, how misleading that was, and how forceful that kind of, you're going to break through to whatever, and it just, to me, is just something to get rid of. It's a kind of thinking.
What's your favorite way to articulate it then?
You just pay attention to your practice And in paying attention to, let's say, mu or any other koan, or even paying attention to the count of the breath, there's not room for two things in the mind. So if you're really paying attention without force, without strain, there's just that breath. There's just mu. There's no one there trying to get anything. There's nothing to get. You're already right there. And to allow that, to experience that, to allow yourself to experience that intimacy with what actually is right in front of you, right here, right now. There's no need to push beyond the self or to push the self aside. That itself is dualistic. It's to allow everything and really be mu, breathe mu. Just be it through and through. And if you really are it, then there's no opposition whatsoever. Everything does step in. And at some point, you realize that. But it's not a matter of forcing yourself to break through something. It's more like, I don't know, there's a metaphor about walking in the rain, walking in the mist. You become as wet as if you're in a downpour. If you just keep walking in the mist, your robe will become as wet as if you were in a heavy downpour. It's that kind of sense. Mm-hmm. And I've seen intimacy work much better for people than in my experience. Again, this is my personality too. I can't say this is the right way to do it, but I found it really helpful. And think of the whole point of Zen, bodhisattva. Bodhi means wisdom. Sattva means being. What's a bodhisattva? Simply someone who's wise enough to choose to mature beyond their own self-centeredness. That dualistic habit of thinking I'm in here and everything and everyone else is out there. If that can fall away through focusing attention on the practice, then that's the path of the bodhisattva, someone who is maturing, becoming a grown-up. That's all that bodhisattva means. A wisdom being is a growing up being, growing beyond their own self-centeredness, which causes all the ills of the world, from climate destruction to misogyny to destruction of indigenous peoples. It all comes from our self-centeredness. And it's a mistake, simply. It's horrifying and tragic. It's simply a mistake in how we use our own minds. And Zen, to me, is a way of correcting that mistake so that we can live in harmony with our own nature and the nature of everything around us. So to me, it's not even really that much anymore of an Asian thing, though I'm sure I'm somewhat wrong about that. I mean, we have Asian forms, we carry them on, but for me, maybe less than at other places. I think it's to grow up as a human being, and that's what Zen offers us.
So as a teacher, what are you looking for in someone to pass mu? I mean, do you feel their bearing changes when you are ready to move them on, or are you looking for specific behavior? Like what is your criteria? Or if it's not something you want to talk about publicly, that's fine too,
What I'm looking for in a student in general is sincerity, honesty and sincerity. That's the foundation of someone that I enjoy working with. And I try to make the point that that's what Zen Buddhism is about, is maturing as a human being. It means a degree of aiming and recognizing there is such a thing as realization, and that we work towards it. But it doesn't mean we discount, the people we are now in order to get something more. And because I have a series of first checking questions, which is
you broke up. Can you say it again? You have a series of what?
Tell it. I don't know. Goodbye, Siri. I have no idea.
Okay. I found this on the web for a series of first get checking questions, which is I don't know why Siri just came on, but
okay,
still I don't know. Goodbye, Siri.
Better be careful what we say. Big Brother is watching. Right. In Diamond Sangha, the way I worked with it was you work on mu and then a long series of checking questions. And then you work on sound of a single hand and its checking questions. And then you do a couple of classic introductory koans. And then you return, miscellaneous, right? And then you return to a final checking question on mu. And someone's not accepted as having passed the first gate and ready to begin the miscellaneous or introductory koans till they've done all that. Mm-hmm. It isn't just a matter of passing mu. And so those checking questions are where you begin to see how a person's responding and if they're able to respond. Someone may have caught a glimpse, don't even notice it themselves, but the checking questions, if they can start responding, they reveal that they have, and then we'll see how it goes. My view is, and again, this is only me. I can't say this is the right way to do it. The way I've worked with people is I'm not looking for an overwhelming experience, a transformative experience. I'm looking for simply someone who is able to begin responding appropriately to the checking questions. If they can, and if they pass through the first gate, all of those checking questions, I then start them on miscellaneous koans. And what I tell them is, you've just begun. Mm-hmm. And what that means is, if you keep ongoing koan practice alive, if you keep doing this years down the road, eventually, at some point, you will have a self-confirming experience. Mm-hmm. That's there. And all those things you read about in the Zen books of people having those experiences, that's not what's here now. What's here now is you have enough to start working on the subsequent to the first koans. You have enough to start responding. If you keep doing that, then it will deepen. It will integrate into your life, and it will open more fully. Even if it's years down the road, don't worry about it. It will. And that's the way I would work with people, to get them up and going and to realize that transformation is a lifelong process. It's not a one-shot deal at all.
I've had a surprising number of people tell me that they felt that they passed mu through too easily. Do you think that's kind of an overly gaining idea on their part, or?
I can't say because I don't know the cases, in the people or whatever. But I know many people who felt that way, and all I can say is to understand that a glimpse of self-nature is not the same thing as satori, which means a much deeper, much more complete experience, and that, like anything else, you're just beginning. And if you keep going, then deeper territory will become accessible. But that initial experience could be so slight, it's just enough to start doing it. It's not like the enlightenment experiences you read about in books. Those people were, most of them, in the koans themselves, were totally committed, many-year practicing, doing only that kind of people. And when they talked about enlightenment, they meant something that we may not have for, I don't know about anyone else, but 20, 30 years of practicing, and especially as lay people, you have a lot to integrate and work with on a daily basis. And the great thing about lay practice is it can never be artificial. If you're practicing as a lay person, it has to be for real. You have no retreat from the anxieties and the difficulties of life on earth. If you have children, if you have a meaningful job, if you have anxieties about money, if you're concerned about climate change, it's in your face every day. You get in the car and you've already made a mistake. You've already committed to destroying the environment. How do you live with those issues? How do you live ethically as a Zen Buddhist in this world? How does your koan practice help you relate to family issues and work issues? So I find that lay practice is a very direct route to very real practice, because it can't be a game. It's got to be something that does something for your life, or why would you do it? but it may start with just a glimpse, enough to feel there's something, I can't get my hands on it, but something has shifted. If you pay attention, you might notice something has shifted. Maybe you're a little more at ease about things. Maybe you're less afraid of death. Maybe you can be alone a little bit more. Maybe when you look at your bookcase, it steps into you and you find yourself in a different way. It's not out there. Maybe when you talk to somebody, you listen better, that there are small shifts that happen all the way along. And then at some point, whether you're in sesshin or not in sesshin, you might be doing something ordinary, everything falls away and it really opens up and you realize what you've been doing all along. And all that koan work before that was preparatory to making something possible that you never would have gotten to if you hadn't had those stressful, struggling, shallow beginnings that you just persisted with.
So the kind of culminating falling away, to bring it back to something we talked about earlier, do you feel that needs to be kind of sudden, or do you think that can be walking in the fog type of a phenomenon?
Realization experiences are both gradual and sudden. You work on them gradually and suddenly they happen, and then you work on them from the suddenly, you're gradually integrating it into your life. So sudden and gradual are just two different ways of, is light, what's that? Is it light a wave or is light a particle? Sudden is.
Do you think it can be gradual and gradual?
It's
Does there have to be a sudden part of the dynamic? I guess is what I'm asking.
I don't know. I don't think there's any have to. It's like if you're seeing more deeply and acting more deeply, something's happened. And in fact, Aiken Roshi was famous for saying nothing much happened. He just kept working at it. He doesn't talk about any overwhelming experience. So I know some things he said of things that happened later on in his practice, but obviously he was a tremendously deep and skillful teacher. So I can't say how it's supposed to be. I can only say I can check someone and see if they can be working on miscellaneous or subsequent koans, or beginning the Wumen Kwan, or beginning Hekigen Roku. And I trust the koan curriculum is my faith, that if they keep going, that curriculum will help them realize their own nature and will do so more deeply. And in fact, the second half of the curriculum is really designed, in my sense, to take away any sense of I've got it that might come from the first half, and the kind of Zen stink, or the developing of a different kind of specialness that's just as bad as before you began. So I trust in the long term of the entire koan curriculum that you have to go the whole route. And of course, for lay people, that's a lifetime commitment, because we've got a lot of other things going on. And the good news is it's going to be for real, and it's going to be integrated into our life, because it's not like we're zipping through the koans in an isolated place and then get released into life and have no idea how to live. We're having to learn how to live and learn how to have realization, or express realization, or realize intimacy in the midst of learning how to take care of families, earn our way in this world, and live an ethical life. So I think it's a very terrific challenge for the Bodhisattva path, what Zen offers.
Yeah. What you're saying makes me think of the traditional Rinzai path, where, they live in a training monastery for, 10, 15, 20 years or whatever, and they work through the curriculum, and they'll get Inca, but at that point, they're not asked to teach. Then they have like 10 years of basically living outside of the monastery, at which point, this is the ideal. Who knows how much it happens. But in case that it hasn't happened, there's been a lot of problems with teacher conduct. So, certainly there's, that's speaking to it, but, it's that kind of speaks to what you're saying. Like, even though they went through a monastic experience, they still needed that maturation after Inca before they're asked to actually
Absolutely.
teach. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, for me, lay path makes the most sense. To me, it seems the most direct way to mature in terms of what Zen offers.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how a fully monastic experience works, but to me, at least for the people who are drawn to me, that's not our path. And I found, Aiken Roshi was completely lay and such a deep and skillful teacher that I have very few doubts about the efficacy of this. Now, don't get me wrong. There's no guarantees. Somebody can act quite self-centeredly no matter which process they go through. There's no guarantee. You can have a lay teacher who really, for lack of a better word, becomes predatory in terms of women or whatever.
Yeah, it certainly happens.
Yeah. So it's still up to, all we can do is do our best and try and, be as careful as we can in terms of whoever is authorized to teach. And those are always very intimate, personal, and difficult decisions, and mistakes obviously can be made.
So I kind of have one last question I'd like to ask you. So you made your living being a storyteller.
As a writer, as an author and storyteller.
Yeah. So one thing I've noticed, and especially after I guess I kind of have a hobby of kind of looking into like kind of the neurobiological underpinnings of practice. Yeah, I'm just fascinated by it. And kind of in conjunction with that and just watching my own mind, I've noticed that really a lot of, or if not all, human suffering comes from the stories that we tell about ourselves and in the world and in the expectations thereof and so forth. Like, how do you feel? I mean, do you see any sort of, I don't even know how I could really articulate this question, but do you see any tension there between clearly humans, part of our, there's just something like primal and fundamentally satisfying about legend and story. It's clearly, it's part of our DNA. But at the same time, our storytelling gets us into all sorts of troubles. Our self-centered storytelling, at least. Do you see any tension there, or like do you see any kind of philosophical resolution, or does the question make sense?
Yeah, it does. There's a fine edge. I mean, I've seen people in the storytelling world say, "Oh, if we only had stories." And not all the television and all that, but had stories in language that bring images alive in our own minds and teach values, then everything would be good. And I go, well, I hate to tell you, Germany had the Grimm's brothers, and that didn't turn out so well. So there's no salvation in that. It really depends what we do with our stories. And of course, you can manipulate people with story, as we're seeing the polarization in our culture. Now, Nazi Germany came out of a story. And then again, as Joseph Campbell has pointed out, myth is maybe as far as language can go before entering a realm of silence and deep experience. And without the steps that myth provides to get us to that, we might never return to that deeper realm. And so obviously language and myth and story are central to our being human, but it's complex territory. And of course, I was drawn to koan practice, which is story-based.
Right,
it's not about sticking in the story. It's allowing the story to open into, it sounds too tricky. It's the story is a doorway. Gateless gate, woman quan. It's a doorway. If you stick with the door, you don't go through the doorway. If you stick with the story, you don't get it. You have to go through the story or allow the story to go through you. And then it becomes so valuable and so important. Then, of course, one of the great teachers burned all the printing blocks with the Blue Cliff Record, the Hekiganroku, because he felt people were getting caught up in the stories.
Right. It was actually his teachers. It was his teacher had made the Blue Cliff Record, and he burned them.
Yeah, I think it was Da Wei who burned the printing block.
Right.
So we're always on the edge of, are we going to be caught? And of course, the great trauma and drama of our life is that we each get caught in a very personal story, and we run it all the time and use it to become a filter through which we look at the world. Whereas it doesn't mean that story doesn't exist, but it's not our actual identity. And when we mistake that story for our actual identity, we lose. Who is it that sees colors with the eyes right now? Who is it that hears sounds with the ears? Who is it that thinks thought? Who's the narrator of our story? We lose all that and get caught in the story. It's like being caught in a dream. There's a koan I just commented on because it's one of my favorites to comment on, which I just posted on our Endless Path Facebook page, which is a dream within a dream. And it's about our lives as a dream within a dream. What does that mean? And is that a bad thing? And how would it change if you were awake? Does that mean the dream is no good? It's fascinating territory. And I love commenting on that because it's a way of looking at myth and story. So you might enjoy that. I just posted it this morning.
I'll check it out. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not yet on the website, but it's on the Endless Path Zendo Facebook page. But it's the thing of our life as a dream. And that's where story becomes both a doorway and becomes our trap. And when you look at our culture and what's happening with story, and then think about what myth has done for you. If you love The Lord of the Rings, that's a transformative story. And yet, there are people who are trying to turn it into a kind of, what's the word? I don't know, white nationalist narrative. It's like you can do.
Oh, like people have done that with Northern mythology, definitely.
Yeah, right. So it's like, the devil can quote scripture. Story is an open-ended phenomenon with tremendous possibility. But, and before we leave, I want to ask you, what is the one edition of The Lord of the Rings you'd recommend? Because I know it's gone through so many different editions and bindings.
Just the, just aesthetically, the binding and everything. Oh boy.
Which would be the edition you'd recommend?
It's the one. All the books in the one edition, and it's illustrated by Howe. I forget his first name. Howe. He was actually the artist who kind of worked for Jackson and coming up with the look and feel of the movies. But yeah, so that's my favorite edition. I mean, there's rarer ones that are neat, but because they're rare. But like as far as just a work of art, I think that's the prettiest.
And when was that published? And is the typeface of it
decades ago? They still print it and put it in bookstores occasionally. I can send you a picture of it.
If you can send me a link or a picture of it, I'd be interested.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay, awesome. So if someone wanted to, so I'll link to your Facebook and website on the description. Great. Is that the best way for people to get a hold of you?
Yeah. They go to, our Facebook page, which is Endless Path Zendo, and then our website is endlesspathzendo.org. I think you have all that information.
Yeah, so I'll link that in the description.
Yeah. I can't think of... Yeah, that's the simplest way. The information should be there. And I post enough stuff that people can get a sense of what they're doing and poke around there and things like that.
If somebody didn't live in Rochester and they wanted to work with you, would you do koans with someone in Zoom?
Yes,
Zoom?
I have students in California, in North Carolina, in Indiana, in New York City, and in Paris, France. So definitely. And the newest book, which is I tried to put in the shortest terms, I think it's like 80 pages, is like my summation of like the importance of the life of the Buddha to Zen practice. Is the new book I just did with Sumeru called Zen Life of Buddha.
Is that released yet, or is that with the editors right now?
Yeah. No, that's available now.
Okay. And what's the title of that?
A Zen Life of Buddha.
Okay, cool.
And that's, to me, the summation of what I've been trying to say all along. And I was able to get it down to 80 pages. So that was still a lot of words, but compared to other books, it's shorter. So
Cool. I will definitely check it out. Thank you so much. I
Good.
really appreciate the time.
It's a pleasure, Barry. You stay well and take care.
Okay.